Hey folks, thanks for tuning back into the Wisdom Nutrition Podcast. This is Alex Sacken, and today I'm sharing an interview that I did recently with Riley Waggaman, who runs a really terrific Substack called Edward Sav Squat, and I'll have the link to that in the description. And he writes and specializes in Russia's commitment to the same Great Reset agenda that the West is moving toward en masse. So, on one front, Russia is the enemy of the West, but on another front, they're following the same technocratic agenda as the West, and they're in the same type of quote unquote lockstep motion to move into a new world paradigm. And by that, I mean they followed completely the whole coronavirus and vaccine mandate narrative. They're also moving towards digital currency at the same pace and rate as America and the EU and UK and China, and several other aspects of the Great Reset agenda you can also find in Russia. So he's been covering this story on his Substack. I was really interested to hear this side of the story because you don't hear much coverage about this. Instead, often Russia is depicted as this enemy of the West and this sort of motion of the West, but really that's not true. And so we're going to be discussing that in the interview, and I hope you enjoy. And definitely subscribe to his Substack if you haven't already. So without further ado, here's the interview with Riley.
Hey, Alex, can you hear me?
Yeah, coming through good.
Cool.
Well, it's nice to meet you, Riley. I appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm glad I caught you while you're briefly in the U.S. I'm not sure what the time difference is in near Moscow where you live, but I'm sure it's substantial.
Yeah, it can be tricky organizing stuff. It's a 8-hour difference on the East Coast. So,
And you live in Russia full time? Like that's your home, am I right?
yeah, I've been there for about 10 years, with just very brief breaks and in the Moscow region primarily. But yeah, so. Mhm.
And I saw on your bio, and I should just mention that you run an excellent Substack called Edward Slav Squat.
Yeah,
And I want to ask you about that name in a minute, but
sure.
I saw on your bio that you used to work for RT. Is that how you originally got brought over to Russia?
Actually, no. I came to Russia basically for absolutely no reason in particular. I was just sort of bored, and I was teaching English when I first came over. And it wasn't in Moscow, it was in Bashkortostan, which is like this little republic in the Russian Federation. And
Mm-hmm.
then shortly after I came over, things got really hot in Ukraine, and that's like the original Ukraine conflict. And I had a background in journalism, so I decided to move to Moscow and start writing. And that's sort of how I came to be at RT.
Okay. So were you into or interested in like the geopolitics of Russia-US relations and things like that beforehand, or is that something you got into once you started working as a journalist?
Yeah, not really. Actually, it's sort of ironic because I came to Russia. I mean, I was completely um, jaded by US politics, right? I had spent about a year in Washington, D.C. after I finished college, doing political journalism, and I absolutely hated it. I hated the two party uniparty. I was
Right.
so sick of it. So actually, I first I went to Central Europe, and then I migrated even further east to Russia in the hopes of just escaping it all. And then right when I got to Russia, like Russia became embroiled in all these geopolitical stuff, especially with the United States, and so it didn't really work out that well for me. But I didn't come there with any sort of special interest in Russia or U.S.-Russia relations. Just sort of dropped in my lap. So
Good, interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Ukraine situation, when you first came there, how that's really come full circle, because there was the coup in 2014. So I'm assuming that's the time period you're talking about when you moved over there.
Yeah, exactly. I moved there shortly before, I guess it was January or February 2013. So like, a few months basically before things really kicked off with Maidan. So
And
yeah.
if I'm remembering right, the coup there, that was basically you had a leader, I can't remember his name, but a Ukrainian
Yanukovych.
president who wanted to basically build ties with Russia, economic ties, and then he was overthrown, and this was the beginning of sort of a stream of puppet regimes in Ukraine, backed by U.S. and NATO.
Yeah, I mean, the basic what basically happened was there's this guy Yanukovych who was more, let's say, more pro-Russia than the people who came after him. And Ukraine, of course, has been in this sort of limbo area where it's trying to keep relations, positive relations, or productive relations with Russia because it's a huge trading partner with Russia. It
Right.
also wants to develop relations with the EU. And basically, what happened was that whatever Yanukovych decided not to go the full 100% EU route for Ukraine, more or less, that's what happened. And so he was uh, overthrown by a bunch of angry psychos. And yeah, that's basically what happened.
Right. And then everything that happened after was kind of building up to this like incremental move to try to put Ukraine into NATO, which they knew would cause Russia to attack. So, it seemed like, that event really set the stage for the Ukraine war because that would have never happened if that coup in 2014 didn't take place.
Yeah, I mean, the reasons for Russia's attack, most recent, in the special military operation, I think, it's a whole discussion that if you want, we could get into it. I think that it's not even really me personally, and a lot of people I know who's been following events very clearly are not are still not really sure what Russia hoped to achieve. It's obvious that they wanted a very swift Crimea-like operation that would be relatively bloodless, hoping for um, to ensure Ukraine's neutrality, as well as some other conditions such as the protection of the people in Donbass, this basically preventing NATO expansion and Washington's encroachment into, I guess, what you would call Moscow's sphere of influence.
Hmm.
The problem, of course, is that while Moscow may have had justifications for it, I would argue, and I think there's a very convincing argument to be made, that um, none of the stated objectives have actually been achieved for Russia and Ukraine. And as a result, I would even say that some of them, the war has actually exacerbated many of the problems that existed before the conflict started in February of 2022. So it's an unfortunate situation. I consider it quite tragic as someone who believes in, Slavic brotherhood between the Slavic states, and
Right.
my own son is part Ukrainian, so it's tough.
Yeah, it's a real tragedy for Ukraine. I mean, it seems like a whole generation of men have been wiped out there. Hearing by the numbers, hundreds of thousands dead. Yeah, it's horrific actually. What has been the impact? Now you've been in Russia experiencing this. What was the change in society in the Russian society, Russian culture that you experienced when it moved into this war footing? And uh, so, what was your experience with that?
Well, I would have to say that at least on the surface level, what's been interesting is at least in Moscow, in the Moscow region, you could say that life more or less went on as normal without, like, your day-to-day life probably wouldn't be, you wouldn't really notice that Russia was embroiled in this conflict.
Hmm.
And that's more or less true even today. Um, but one thing that really maybe changed this dynamic was with the partial mobilization that occurred in autumn of last year. And but that a lot of that happened in the regions, like not in the big cities, but in more rural parts of Russia. And from speaking with friends and people I know, um, I think that there was a lot of support initially, and now people are like kind of wondering why did they have to be mobilized and what has been accomplished over the last 2 years. And in this sense, the war is maybe starting to come home. Uh, it's interesting to me also, just as an observation, that at the onset of the war, you had this sort of the Z slogan and symbol that was used to sort of represent the special military operation, and it, I wouldn't say that it was plastered everywhere, but it could be found even in Moscow, and there were banners and things like that, and all that is gone. And in fact,
Mm.
it's very, very difficult now in Russia to find a Z anywhere, which is also quite interesting. And maybe that has something to do with, there's a presidential election in Russia coming up. And I always mess this up. I believe in April, March or April. Maybe it's May. It's coming up in the next few months.
Hmm.
And so for whatever reason, the Russian government has calculated that ordinary Russians don't really want to be reminded of this conflict. But to get back to sort of the original thrust of your question, on the economic front, I would say that there has been inflation. There's been problems with, like getting certain kinds of spare car parts if you own a foreign vehicle, things like that. Some of this might have to do with the war directly. Some of it might also just be from other sanctions from before it even started. I
Hmm.
can't speak to that specifically. I would say, though, that the general situation, I think that there was this expectation you would read about in the West that the Russian economy was going to collapse and there would be, uh, you know, chaos in the streets. And that's not the situation in Russia, although obviously for those who are the most disadvantaged, things are hurting more than those who have, you know, uh, some level of economic comfort in
Right.
Moscow, for example. And there was one other thing I wanted to say about that, though. Oh, well, obviously, and then again with the very bizarre and frightening Prigozhin's and Wagner's what do they call it, the March of Justice or whatever on Moscow,
Right.
was very, very scary for Russians. And I mean, I wasn't in Russia at the time, but it was also I mean, I have family in the Moscow region. It was also pretty creepy, and Russians really, just because of their long tumultuous history, really, really, really value stability, and I think it really spooked a lot of people. So that's a very direct result of the conflict, that there was a private mercenary army that allegedly, seemingly sent tanks zooming towards the capital for a short
Right.
period of time. So, yeah, I don't know. It's one of these things that you could see things potentially getting more precarious. Like, is this war going to lead to internal problems in Russia? Possibly, or maybe things will just keep plodding along as they've gone. It's very difficult to say. I've tried to watch developments closely. Um, yeah, we'll see. The next few months in Russia, I think, are going to be very interesting to observe how things unfold with the election, how what a lot of people are saying that there's potential negotiations that are underway in Ukraine about regarding Ukraine. I don't know if that's true or not. So I think that the next few months potentially will answer a lot of questions about what are the long-term consequences of the Ukraine conflict for Russia. So I guess we have to wait and see.
Right. When you're talking about the mobilization of Russia, are you talking about like the reserve, basically the military reserves, like people being activated and put on active duty?
Yeah, so there was a partial mobilization, and it was supposed to be of, I think, at least on paper, of reservists. So people who had served in the military, or in Russia you have a compulsory military service,
Right.
and so if
Okay.
you went through that process, it's like a year. Um, then I believe this is how it worked, that you'd be on some list and they could call you up. In reality, though, just like in Ukraine, they were pulling people off the street,
Really?
especially in the rural areas. And also a lot of people, I mean, they just found other ways to, you know, it wasn't so clear cut. It wasn't, if you're an eligible, trained uh, former soldier, you'd be sent. There was a lot of not so good things happening. And that whole process, though, I mean, it was so unpopular that Moscow didn't try to do it again, even though they really needed more troops on the ground, and they switched to basically using contract service with very, very enticing contracts. Like basically, if you sign up to go to Ukraine right now in Russia, you're going to make, I don't know, somewhere between 5 to 10 times as much as you would make just doing a civilian job. And then that's just regular army too. You can also sign up with the PMC. Like, I mean, I don't know if Wagner's still actively recruiting, but Wagner is not the only Russian PMC operating in uh, Ukraine. There are several. So it's been interesting to see how Moscow has juggled this. It's a very, very strange situation where it's like they need to get boots on the ground. They don't want to call another round of mobilization or partial mobilization. And so they've been trying to entice people with these, contract service. And according to Moscow, it's been somewhat successful. I think they say that they've raised like an army of 500,000 or something like that. So,
And the Wagner Group, that's a little bit like it's a military contractor in the sense it's a bit like Blackwater,
yeah.
and they're really stationed around foreign assets to protect foreign assets and to sort of wage covert operations in a variety of parts of the world. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Wagner or PMCs in general, but I believe that the general premise here, like with all PMCs, is that they're basically used when a government can't really openly declare that it has some kind of interest in a foreign country or needs to achieve something militarily in a foreign land. And from what I've read, yes, Wagner is active, for example, in Africa to protect investments there that are natural resources, extraction, things like that.
Right.
And for a long time, actually, the Russian government denied even the existence of Wagner. For example, they were active in Syria, but it was always this sort of hush hush thing, where it's like, oh, there
Mm.
are these mercenaries in Syria, but who are they? And the Russian government was very hands off about it. They didn't say very much about it. And so it's interesting how, it's a very, very strange conflict in the sense you have this war that seems to be, it really does feel like if Russia doesn't end this war on terms that are not just acceptable, but are advantageous to it, that it really could cause problems internally in the long run. And yet they seem to be relying on PMCs, or at least they were, which I find to be very, very strange. I mean, the whole concept to me is quite extraordinary. And so, yeah, the PMC angle, very curious.
Yeah, some of the analysis I've been reading about the Middle East situation, I'm not sure if you've been following that, but uh, if they're in light of their possibly expanding into a larger regional war, I've heard discussion that this could be a second front that Russia would be drawn into an alliance with Iran and to protect its interests in being able to draw from the energy markets of the Middle East. Have you seen anything about that or read anything discussion about that in the Russian media?
Yeah, like an actual military alliance with Iran, I don't know. Maybe. I mean, who know? I mean, the Middle East is who knows what's going to happen there, right? It's just a powder keg ready to blow. I'm not going to discount such a possibility. I don't see it as maybe the most likely outcome, just as things stand right now. I mean, obviously there is a level of close cooperation between Iran and Russia, especially on um, in the economic sector. But and also, actually, we should point out that Iran has been giving Russia drones to use, which have been used quite extensively in Ukraine. But whether that kind of military cooperation would take a new, they're going to double down on it, or what form of cooperation we'll see in the months ahead, anyone's guess.
Yeah. Well, just going back to this idea of Russian media and versus US media, you're kind of in a position where you're able to consume content from both realms. How do you compare them, especially with an event like Ukraine war, where you have sort of a clear for the most part, usually a clear perspective from the West. Like, obviously, you're going to get a counter perspective in Russia, but just in terms of the analysis you're seeing, is there anything valuable about this sort of state of geopolitics in the world that you're seeing from Russian analysts that you don't see in the West, or that's not being brought over?
Yeah, I think that in the West, especially among what you might generally call sort of the disaffected West, like
Hmm.
Westerners who understand that their media is lying to them or is giving them a very, very biased, one-sided view of current events, I think that there's this, and again, very understandable, uh, it's very understandable that they do this. There's this habit that people have where in order to um, you know basically counter this very one-sided narrative, they'll just swing to the opposite direction, which is we're going to believe everything that the Kremlin says in their press releases. RT, which is Russian state media, is benevolent, and anything that they say
Right.
is truthful, and without we don't need to go deeper into any of those topics. I think that disaffected Westerners have a tendency to, for example, they might understand that the political system in the West is full of scammers and corrupt, slugs, and it's basically just horrible in every way possible. And then they have a tendency to idealize the politics of the East in Russia and China and so forth without understanding that there's also human beings running these countries, and many of them are also not very pleasant and also are deeply corrupt, or
Hmm.
they don't really care about people, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the benefit that I really, really encourage people to read Russian language media about Russia. And actually, there's a very wide range of it. It's not this idea that you can't have a lively discussion in Russia about what's happening in Russia is not true. Lots of interesting sources to consult, especially on Telegram, but also there's websites, there's like YouTube channels, whatever. And what these sources bring is just like really badly needed nuance and depth to issues that I think just suffer from vast generalizations in the
Hmm.
West. So it's either like, you're either talking to someone in the West who thinks that Ukraine is about freedom and democracy, or someone who thinks it's about, fighting the globalists and stopping the Satanists or whatever, right? And creating a gold-backed ruble that will destroy the Federal Reserve System. I mean, stuff that's really pretty out there. And once you actually just dive into certain realities, you start to wonder like why is the conversation so why are we stuck in like this sort of false paradigm or whatever, where it's like one or the other, and we can't just sort of dig down into the nitty gritty and try to find out what's really going on here.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would say. And what's really interesting too is that the coverage in Russia of the conflict in Ukraine much more varied, a lot of more interesting commentary than you'll find anywhere in the West, in my opinion. Mostly because Russians have the most at stake here, right? They have
Hmm.
the most to lose. And one website that I really like citing, it's a website called Military Review. It's the number one most popular military news and commentary sort of news portal in Russia, in the Russian language. And they have a very lively commentary section, op-ed section. And the op-eds you'll read there are very, very critical of Russia's war effort. They'll point out like deep corruption in the Russian Ministry of Defense. They'll point out like very, very severe tactical problems or just a lack of strategic thinking. They'll ask what has actually been accomplished. Things
Hmm.
like this, stuff that you will never really find in what you might call, generally the alternative media in the West. And so again, um, there really is this very strange gap between how Russia is talked about in Russia and how Russia is talked about in the West, even among those who consider themselves pro-Russia, right? And at least in my own little way, I try on my blog just to highlight some of these voices in Russia who are very credible, have I would consider them to be actually some of the most credible sources you can um, refer to, and just point out like this is what they're actually saying. This is what Russians in Russia are saying in Russian about their own country, and why aren't people talking about this? So that's a common theme of my blog.
Well, one thing, and that's appreciated because that's a window or that's an area that it's hard to gain access to for the West because I think partly because of the language barrier.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
Although I guess now there's some translate AI apps and stuff that could be used, but it is a barrier. Like Russian cutting edge like opinion and analysis isn't breaking through very much. So one might think that in Russia it was just like the party line there wouldn't be is allowed and there wouldn't be a
Right.
kind of freedom of to be critical. And you're saying that it's not the case at all. It is a complex ecosystem of thought. It's not just like the state like rules everything. The party
I
line.
again, it is interesting how people have this misconception that there isn't. I mean, there's a very, very lively debate about current events in Russia. You just have to know where to look, and I understand why most people don't, and it is because of the language barrier. I think it's also because, unfortunately, and again, this is just human nature. We have a habit of just falling into this sort of like group think or in group thinking where
Right.
people who are like, CNN lies to us, Fox News lies to us. Let's see what RT is saying, or let's see what these guys who are against, the US empire are saying. Oh, like they're telling me blah 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 blah. Well, okay. I mean, they're welcome to their perspective, their viewpoints. I think it's a little bit strange that someone who is understands that the US government lies can't understand why maybe if you want to learn about what the Russian government is doing, you probably shouldn't rely as a primary source on Russian government funded news, but whatever.
Right.
It's like we got to diversify here. Like it's I think that reading RT is actually valuable. I also think that reading Voice of America can be valuable sometimes. But we got to diversify here, and we got to get perspectives that haven't been literally paid for by governments.
Right.
So,
Now, when you were working in RT, was there much more of a focus on like only certain viewpoints are going to be permitted here, given that
so
it's
the thing about RT, which was also, I mean, it was a very eye-opening experience, and I say that like personally because I think what happens, a lot of people who work for RT, again, they're disaffected Westerners who understand that their own governments are lying, and they want to expose this. They want a platform where they can help expose the lies and the hypocrisy of their own governments. RT offers that platform,
hmm
and you also get a salary for it, and I can totally understand why people would be attracted to that and find that to be a pretty good deal. The problem though is that if you live in Russia and you care about Russia and you're interested in what's happening inside Russia and Russian policy, government policy, both internationally and domestically, RT is not the place to work because you're absolutely limited by what you're allowed to say about what's actually happening inside the country.
hmm
And you're not allowed to use that same sort of critical thinking when we're talking about the West. If you try to direct that at the Russian state, you're going to get shot down. They're not going to let you do that. And what ends up happening though is that a lot of people who work at RT they'll never even consider criticizing the Russian government, even if they're criticizing the U.S. government for doing the exact same thing, because it's a form of it's basically a lot of media runs on self censorship right now, right? It's not
hmm
you don't get a memo saying you can't say bad things about the Russian government. They select people who aren't interested, right? They're not interested in criticizing the Russian government. They're there
Right.
because they want to pound the Western imperialists or whatever, and so it would never occur to them in 1,000 years to take a step back and be like, all right, I really don't like, for example, forced vaccination policies. I'm going to write about what's happening in the West, but I'm not going to even think about what's happening in Russia. And so that's sort of what ends up happening, right? And
Yeah.
you get yeah, I mean that's how media works everywhere
Yeah.
in
I'm about
any
to say
country.
it sounds like a similar dynamic in the West, in America.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. Like that's the entire formula that all state media uses, like Radio Free Liberty. They don't, they do good work. They'll highlight, corruption and abuses in other countries. They're not doing it because they care. They're doing it because it's what the U.S. State Department wants to make themselves look good and make other people look bad. All right.
yeah.
So
Um, well, in my thinking, the any event that happens in the world, and even historically over the past 100 plus years, can't be understood without reference to the idea that the U.S. has played host to a covert empire and has a global basically empire replacing the British Empire before it. But in America and in UK, EU, like you almost never see reference to that idea. For some reason, it's people are still locked on the level of nation states and don't see America as this giant empire. Now, Russian analysts, I would assume, would be more prone to take the view of analyzing America as an empire, as I think Middle Eastern analysts would as well. But when you read critiques of America, is it looking at American oligarchy and the deep state and things like that? Is that more uh, typical to find in Russian critical thinking?
yeah, I would say I think that it would be fair to say, and this is even in some fairly mainstream publications. One in particular I would say is Sauergrad, which is sort of it's more conservative with a sort of Orthodox Christian slant. It's actually run by quite a prominent oligarch in Russia, but they actually do a lot of interesting reporting and a lot of interesting analysis. And the idea of what we're basically what you might describe as these networks of groups and organizations or people, business people, whatever you want, entrepreneurs of great influence who are able to extend their tentacles across the globe. This is something that definitely I think Russians are aware of on some level. Uh, I mean, they're certainly aware of it because it happened to their own country. I mean, you could say that the history of post-Soviet Russia, or even Soviet Russia itself, has basically been about Western meddling.
Right.
And actually, I mean that's a chapter. I mean, that's a part of Russian history since the time of Peter the Great. So Russians are definitely aware of it. And I think that today you'd find even that, um, yeah, I don't think it's even really a controversial idea. What form it takes might differ. I would also say in general that Russians are much more open to just sort of chewing the fat and just talking. Like you could just go to, if you meet some Russian, you go to their house or their apartment, you sit down, you have a drink with them, and they might just blurt out of nowhere like, did you know that there's been three Putins? Like there's Putin clones. And you'd be like, what? And they're like, yeah, like this is not the original Putin. They like cloning him. You're like, oh, okay. Like they're much more open to just throwing stuff out there, and it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter. Like people don't get really upset about it. It's much more fun to talk about politics in Russia just because they're without the two-party system. People don't look at each other as potential rivals. They just like talking about like, hey, like what is actually going on? Like, do you have a theory? Yeah, I have this theory. Like, Putin is a clone. Like, oh no, no, it's like it's the royal British royal government, royal family, and they're controlling everything. No, no, it's like the Rothschilds, and you can just talk for hours about this kind of stuff with them. So, yeah.
Well, just up to now, we've been talking about Russia, United States as competing powers. But one of the things I like about your blog, and this is how I actually got into your work, is everything that you've done tracking Russia's movement in the same direction of the West, America, et cetera, in terms of the Great Reset, in terms of the lockdowns, the pandemic, and everything like that. And so you have this interesting dynamic where, on one level, there's this competition between these two countries, but on a deeper level, maybe we call it the technocratic level, there is this alliance, and they seem to both be going in the same direction as the EU, China, and the rest. Could you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of them, what you might call them movements towards technocracy on all levels, whether it's through the UN or some other organization. I mean, the reality is that the East is leading the way, right? This idea that Moscow would serve as a bulwark against technocracy, I mean, it's objectively absurd because in many ways, Moscow is far ahead of basically every Western state in implementing stuff that would be openly applauded at Davos or whatever weird UN committee or
Right.
the Rockefeller Foundation or whatever. And so it's like, and again, it's just very easy to document that, and I don't think that's even a controversial statement to make. And people, when I point this out to people, they get very, very defensive. I don't really understand why. Like, if you're against this kind of, global panopticon, and you don't want to live in a world where, cameras are watching every movement you make and registering you, and, you have some kind of chip that you pay for your daily whatever ration. uh, I feel like there needs to be a little bit more solidarity and less defensiveness. Uh, and again, like Russia is not some government. The Russian government is not something a body that we should look up to and admire. If you're worried about technocracy, it's a warning to the rest of us. And you talk to many prominent conservative Russian activists, or not just conservative, anyone on the far left, whatever you want to, however you want to define that, and on the far right. And some of these people even are Putin supporters. They write and document every day about how Russia is slowly marching to this same sort of, technocratic drumbeat that we see playing out across the world. And this is especially true, I would say, in developments in education, which is the most worrying because uh, I think there's also this tendency for people to think like, well, I'm never going to agree to, a digital ID, so it's never going to happen. Well, okay, cool, but you're going to die one day. I am too. And the people who come after us are being conditioned to think that this is normal.
Hmm.
And, we can look back 100 years, the idea of an international passport system was considered absurd, right up until the beginning of World War One. And now people can't imagine a world without passports. In fact, they get angry or upset if you suggest that maybe you don't need an international passport system and everything would be okay. But now it's ingrained in our minds, like, oh, I need a passport to go travel somewhere.
Right.
You didn't need to do that 100 years ago. 1913, almost unheard of. So it's like time is not really on our side. Neither is history. That's just a fact. And we should be very worried about what's happening in Russia and other countries. I mean, China is obviously a big one, but in general, again, like with CBDCs, digital IDs, biometric identification systems, right, like facial recognition cameras, you can go down the list, and Moscow is at the head of the pack. So again, it's something that people need to be aware of, and I think it's something that we should be working with our compatriot, our friends in Russia, to push back against this insanity.
Uh, like when you're in Moscow, like, are you starting to see some of these changes? Are they starting to manifest themselves in a more tangible way? Because here in America, you know, there was a lot of talk about this during the lockdown period, and it was more like kind of in your face, and you were forced to confront it. But then it all kind of fizzled out, and it's almost
Yeah.
like people don't even acknowledge that any of this stuff happened. It's interesting, but did it kind of fizzle out in Russia, or what's it been like the past couple of years?
Yeah, I think that definitely there's been absolutely starting in like early 2022, a lot of the most egregious, affronts to human dignity were slowly rolled back. But for example, in Moscow, they have this system called face pay, where you can pay for your metro ride, in the subway with your face, like it's a biometric payment system. They're also rolling out similar kind of systems, on a small scale in certain, I think, grocery stores or retail chains. And again, a lot of this stuff is being directed at school children. Like there's this initiative across the country, like the smart school initiative, where yeah, where basically they're giving kids biometric IDs, right? You enter your school by showing your face, and that's how you get in. And so I would say, like, you could go a day in Moscow and not think about how everyone's watching you. But the reality is there's like 200,000 cameras in the city watching your every movement, and most of them are hooked up to a facial recognition system,
Mm,
and they can track like your every movement. In fact, there were stories in Russian state media and TASS talking about how Russian conscripts, so like young guys who were supposed to do their mandatory 1 year military service, they were in the metro and they were just stopped by the cops. They were flagged by the facial recognition system, being like, this guy should be in the military right now. Why isn't he, you know, at the training grounds? And they just grab him and pull him away. So it's pretty serious. I think we're only beginning to see what these kind of systems are capable of,
right.
unfortunately.
Yeah, there's been talk among people like Whitney Webb about potentially the next phase, accelerating that being a sort of cyber attack, false flag potentially, and that's predicted possibly for 2024. Um, I think that the migration situation, I don't know if you've been following this story, but what's happening in the US, it's actually UK and EU too. There's been this sort of like engineered migrant crisis coming in, and that could be another situation that could, cause havoc, which would inevitably lead to digital ID adoption and things like that. So, yeah, there's a number of issues that could accelerate this trend for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting how they talk about it too. Like these new UN initiatives and the stuff that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing and other, charitable organizations, philanthropic organizations. They talk about how a digital ID is a human right. Like
Right.
every person should have a digital ID because this is the gateway to, government services and travel and opportunity. And it's so, I mean, it's so cynical. I mean, it's sort of brilliant, but it's so cynical. And also, I'll just point out really quickly, actually, this same sort of phenomenon with the migration is also applicable in Russia. It's actually incredible how you don't really hear about it, but in Russian media, especially alternative media, people are screaming at the top of their lungs about how there's this huge, like, wave of migration coming from Central Asia, and how, and I have to say, like, I've witnessed it myself in my suburb in Moscow. Like, the population is noticeably more people from Central Asia. Like, it just is. Like, that's just a documented fact from 2 years ago. And people are really worried about it because Russia is suffering, like many countries, from a very serious demographic crisis. Birth rates are down. People aren't having enough children. Natural population decline has been pretty consistent. Like, there's no actual increase in the population. And a lot of Russians, again, on both, whatever you want to call it, on across the political spectrum, have been really like screaming about this issue for quite a long time. That they're worried that basically Russia in 10 years is not going to look like it was, today at all. It's going to be, you know, mostly Central Asians, which
Wow, that's
is cool.
fascinating. I wasn't aware that Russia was undergoing the same thing as these other countries, like a forced migration crisis that.
Yeah, yeah, I can send you some links later, but it's something that's talked about pretty regularly, especially like in alternative media. And so yeah, it's a big issue, very
And
big issue.
it's this is all happening, it seems, sort of under the surface of the normal government process in terms of at least the democratic processes or processes by which the citizenry engages with the government in terms of what policies are being enacted. Like this is something that is sort of uh, being implemented at a deeper level, and it's interesting that it's happening in Russia too, because from what I can tell, this is something that's being driven by the UN, and because America is really the backbone of the UN, it's really being driven by the American military industrial complex for whatever reason, and the sort of technocratic state that exists in America. So it's fascinating that America's quote unquote enemies are following the same programs that the West is. I mean, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and it's not, whether how deep that goes with migration, I can't say, but I mean, you basically said it, man. Like, if you just look at what Russia signs up for, I mean, it's everything that their alleged enemies in the collective West are doing. Russia's still on the G20. They're still signing all these insane documents talking about how, they think the whole world should be tagged and vaxxed and blah, blah, blah. It's pretty disheartening stuff. And some people say, like, oh, they're just playing along, right? They just want a seat at the table. And well, okay, maybe, but they're still like they're enacting the stuff that they're playing along with. So I don't know if that's really a very good argument. But I guess we'll see. Gotta wait on that one.
With the vaccine stuff, were they doing was basically the population forced to get the vax there, or how did it play out?
Yeah, well, okay. Forced. I guess we could split hairs here with force. Obviously, they're not holding people down and injecting them, but it was absolutely coercive. It was if you don't get vaccinated or have proof of vaccination, you lose your job, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you can't go to university, or in some cases, you can't get medical treatment. Like they were in some regions, they were very, very strict about, for example, if you had to like test negative in order to get into a hospital or something. But and also, of course, they did this QR code system, right? This digital health pass, which was instituted in every region of Russia, but was obviously there was levels of enforcement depending on the region, where businesses were required to ask for proof of either vaccination or negative status, COVID test status from the last 72 hours or something like this. And so it was really quite brutal, even compared to some Western countries. And even what's really incredible about it is that in January of last year, so January 2023, a year ago, there were still Russians who were appealing to Putin to have this like rule rescinded because they still couldn't go back to work. They're still being asked for their vaccination status.
Mm.
Again, because the country is so big and the way that Russia works, it's basically you get the decree from the center, from the Kremlin, and the regions have a fair bit of leeway on how they want to enact these decrees. So really, enforcement again, it really depended on where you were. But at least in theory, I mean, the rules on paper were extremely strict and draconian and obviously anti-health, just like they were everywhere else.
Right.
And that's the most upsetting thing. Like, I guess you could make the argument that the Russian government really felt that this was necessary. But then you have to wonder, there was a natural population decline in Russia of over 1 million people. There's never been that such a loss of life. Like, that's worse than the darkest days of the 90s. Like, that's
Mm.
worse than Yeltsin Russia. And so you would think that if the Russian government was really, really concerned about, this alleged virus killing people, that they would, I don't know, have an inquiry. Like, let's investigate what went wrong. What can we do better? Things like that. Nothing like that. But they're still pushing the vax. Although a lot of these coercive vaccination decrees, actually, I think pretty much all of them have been rescinded, thankfully. But it's very, very telling, and it's very worrying that there's never been like a in just like in the rest of the West, or they sort of like they do these fake inquiries, but there was never a time when Putin or someone else got up in front of a camera and was like, wow, that was a big disaster, we can't do that again, like we got to figure out what went wrong and make sure that this doesn't happen.
Right.
Nothing like that. Still pushing the vax, which is really too bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Seriously. So when we put all this stuff together, it seems like the motion of events is driving inexorably towards the formal establishment of, I would say, world government. And in many ways, we're looking at the coordination that exists between all these different countries and regions of the world already. You could say it already exists, maybe subtly, but hasn't been formally implemented. But is that your reading too? I mean, do you feel like these events are moving in stages towards something that is seems inevitable, which is the establishment of a formal system of world government incorporating all these different regions of the world, probably at a level of like a technocratic kind of governance model.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably make a pretty strong argument that we're already there for the simple reason that world government already exists because there's already world business, right? And
Right.
what really controls governments? Just money, I guess, and also I don't know, blackmail from intelligence services or whatever. I mean, let's take a concrete example, which is the war in Ukraine. And on its surface, I understand why a lot of people look at the conflict in Ukraine like, well, this is clear proof that there are two distinct blocks. One is, Russia and whatever the multipolar world order, whatever you want to call it, and the other
Hmm.
side is the collective West, and their time is over, and Ukraine is the battleground where this is all being decided. I was like, okay, that sounds pretty cool on its face, but then explain to me why Moscow is paying Kiev to transport Russian gas across Ukraine, which is still happening. In fact, there was a report in TASS, Russian state media, from 2 days ago, January 4th, announcing that Russia signed another gas agreement with Ukraine to transport however million metric cubic feet or tons or whatever of gas across the territory of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are like vaporizing each other and maiming each other in
Right.
trenches. It's like obviously there's the ideologies and politics that us peasants are supposed to buy into and get behind and die for, and then there's a higher level where it's just business as usual and
Right.
nobody cares, and like whoever wins, but all oligarchs got to make a buck, right? And so it's like it's very very hard for me, as much as I want to, like, I get why people, they might hear what I have to say and like, well, this guy's just trying to bum me out. Like, I need something big to hope for. I need something that I can wrap my teeth into and be like, wrap my teeth into. I need something that'll give me hope. Like,
Yeah.
US and the West are evil. I need something that's not evil.
Right.
I get it, man. Like, trust me, I was there too. Like, I was there. And but unfortunately, just a process that began several years ago, a lot of it having to do with the, so-called pandemic, like I can't I can no longer like justify Russia doing all the things that I criticize the West for doing,
Right.
Like, that's a problem for me. And then when you look at what is happening geopolitically, it's like, is the average Russian and average American actually benefiting from any of this? Like, I know we spent a lot of time talking about, yeah, whatever, like all the weapons that are, the vast sums of money wasted in the United States when 20% of American children live below the poverty level. Well, same thing's true in Russia. I mean, Russia has a horrific problem with poverty, and it's also one of the most. I mean, the wealth inequality in Russia is on the same level as it is in the United States, and in some ways, it's even more depressing and horrific. And so, like, I just wonder, like, yeah, there's obviously, we're obviously stuck, again, in this sort of false paradigm where we're expected to buy into certain these certain, whatever you want to call it, myths, right? Like geopolitical myths, while our overlords, which I think is just an international oligarchy in
Hmm.
various forms, are just sipping champagne, having a good time. And so is it sucks, but I don't, I don't know. I don't know what other logical conclusion can be made at this point.
Right. I saw just to kind of as we're wrapping things up, I saw that some of your recent posts have to do with life in rural Russia that you moved to a kind of a farming kind of lifestyle. Um, so it sounds like you're committed to staying in Russia. So what? Tell me a little bit about some of the things that you've liked about living in Russia. And what keeps you there, keeps you wanting to live there, despite everything that we're talking about.
Yeah, so I'm absolutely committed to staying in Russia long term. As you alluded to, I own a piece of property in Novgorod, which is a region that's basically between, it's north of Moscow but south of St. Petersburg. And I have this home in this little village. tiny little village in Novgorod, and I'm there with a few friends who also own property, and we've been raising animals and growing vegetables and just trying to, make a life for ourselves and just try to become more self-sufficient and also just, try to get back to the basics. Like this is a place where there's no running water. You got to get your water from a well. And let me tell you something. You appreciate every glass of water when you have to haul it from a well. Like just the little things in life, like the little pleasures of life become so amazing. And I love that feeling. And I think that a lot of things that get us down and we spend a lot of time we feel sorry for ourselves or think that there's no hope. Like I really encourage people to try to get back to the basics because there's a lot of beauty in life. There's a lot of people just living very simply and very happily. And I don't want to over romanticize a village life because it is quite difficult. But
Right.
if it's working out for me. I'm having a great time there. I really want to share my experiences with other people. I want to bring more people to come visit and see if it's something that they're interested in or learn from other people, about how to make life there better. And again, I would come down to, what why do this in Russia and not somewhere else? I mean, I really like the people, just salt of the earth, hardworking, fun, laid back people who are living simple lives that aren't cluttered by a lot of uh, the bizarre word salad and endless YouTube rants that we find on the internet every day. And you just
Hmm.
escape it all and grow root vegetables and milk cows, and life is good. So don't I don't want people to get bummed out. I'm sorry if they are. I don't know, go milk a cow or something. Like
And
like
how
it's
how are you
okay.
learning about how to run a farm? Is this your first experience doing stuff like that?
So I'm like a late arrival. So I was supposed to be there like a year ago, and I wasn't. I was in the country of Georgia, like just hanging out, being lazy. But I eventually arrived, and so my friends who had also bought property there had already had a good head start, and they had learned from the villagers. Like they went there with almost no experience in anything, and they had to learn the hard way. I mean, for example, like just one example with the cows. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with cow milking. It's very physically taxing,
Hmm.
like this movement you have to do with your hands, and you got to do it twice a day. And if you don't do it twice a day, your cow can develop an infection and die, I guess, or something like that. Bad things will happen.
Hmm.
And like the cow will get sick sometimes, or you got to do other things. And I mean, it's like a lot of work. And they just had to go. They went there and they got the cow and they begged some local villagers to be like, "Will you please teach me how to milk this thing?" And they learned. It's a learning experience for all of us.
And there's a lot of people talking in like the health community about the benefits of drinking raw milk, like
Oh
particularly
yeah.
fresh raw milk. So you got that.
Look, I'll tell you, I don't know. Again, I don't know how much experience you have with drinking milk like fresh from the udder, but it's amazing. Like it's so good. And we're also really interested in making cheese. We're still working on that. But I'm really excited for the possibility of unlimited cheese, just like
Yeah.
just just a room. I just imagine a room full of wheels of cheese. That's my that's
That
my
sounds
goal,
delicious.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's uh that's what's keeping me. That's why I wake up in the morning. I want to develop my village. I have hope. I just think that it's time for us not to place all our apples in a government basket and just try
Right.
to be human. Like
Yeah.
if you think that something's wrong, let's just say, like, if you think that digital IDs are bad, they're bad. Like we don't have to make excuses for the Russians or the Chinese or the Americans or the
Right.
EU people. Like let's just be ourselves, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, man. Cheers to that. All right, Riley. It was great talking with you. I really appreciate you joining me. Let's stay in touch.
Absolutely, Alex. Thanks for having me.
All right, man. Cheers.
Take care.